Giles Laverack of Scotia Seeds, and he's going to talk about what's the point of wildflower seeds. So he's currently Secretary of the European Native Seed Producers Association and has been for 2 years. Managing Director of Scotia Seeds for 28 years. And he worked in seed technology at the University of Edinburgh. And he worked with Alex Twyford, who's here, on student projects. And I've seen he's given lectures and organised things all over the place, including one with Jane McIntosh, who was part of the BES for a long time. So I welcome you tonight to give your talk, and I hope you'll take some questions afterwards.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name's Giles Laverack, and I set up this company called Scotia Seeds about 28 years ago, and I'm still running it along with my wife and a team of 3 other people. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's really, it's great to be back in amongst people again, actually, after all the time away in COVID. It's all very well doing things by Zoom, but there are limits, you know, to what you can do. And I really appreciate you all coming out in person today when you could have possibly seen something on Zoom instead. I don't think that's working, Greg. Okay.
Side there, the front one blanks in there. That one forward.
Great, thank you. So I call this what's the point of wildflower seeds? And I immediately thought, oh, that's a bit of a negative title. People really want to hear about that. I don't know whether I was just having a bad day or what. I kind of immediately thought, dear. But then I thought, well, it's a good chance to reflect on 25 years of work, really, and whether what we've done and whether it's been worthwhile. But I thought also that asking a question probably raised a lot more questions, and I'm sure it probably will as we go through, raise all sorts of things with you. To start with, we're all used to these headlines constantly about the state of nature and you know what mess we're in with biodiversity. And this one's just from the BBC last week, and so it's quite easy to get depressed about this sort of stuff. It's daily stuff. So I thought I'd get that out of the way first. I'm not going to give lots of statistics about how much we've lost, how desperate things really are. I'm sure because you must hear that all the time, and it gets depressing, and it's too close to Christmas anyway to have all that sort of gloom. So we'll get that out of the way as soon as I can. But we're constantly hearing about loss of habitat and plant communities. So species-rich communities like this one, which would have been very common in the past, are now just reduced to pockets, really. So much of this kind of grassland, for example, has just disappeared, and it's gone with the development of housing, of industry, of roads, but particularly with agriculture and with forestry. So the sort of diverse grasslands of the last slide have been replaced by very, very simple plant communities that often just have 2 or 3 species. Sometimes even less. So this picture of a silage field in East Lothian probably only has a couple of species in it, compared to the the kind of grassland in the last slide, which would probably have been an agricultural grassland in the past. It's a worldwide problem. The UN has started now a decade of ecological restoration to try and combat this, and everyone is talking about it around the world. So we hear it in the COP, and we're already well into this decade. So it translates everywhere into a level where we can't actually become involved with it. So in Scotland, it has formed the background, I suppose, for the biodiversity strategy up to 2045. And this document, this draft, was published on Tuesday. So it's very new, and I had a quick look through it because I'm always looking to see whether there's anything that mentions wildflower seeds. And so I'm very pleased to find that there isn't a mention as you kind of leaf through the document. So it does say something about using wildflower seeds to establish more diverse grasslands in an urban setting. So of course, someone who grows and sells wildflower seeds, I'm very happy to see that. So what is the point of wildflower seeds then? I thought that I would use a few projects that we've been involved with to illustrate some of the issues that that affect the use of wildflower seeds. We're not really talking about natural seed dispersal then. We're not talking about the seeds that grow on the plants themselves and are naturally dispersed. But what we're talking about is intervening in that in some way to take the seeds and move them somewhere else. So we are actually talking about translocations, and I will talk about native seeds of native plants in Scotland, and probably use the term native seeds rather than wildflower seeds. Wildflower seeds is a good popular term, but it doesn't really cover all the other things like the grasses or or shrubs, for example. And we're dealing potentially with anything really that's native to Scotland. So in some cases, seeds are being used, to target individual species. Sometimes they're being used to create whole communities, or sometimes they're used specifically to target animal species, like insects. For example, there's a lot of work using seeds for bees or for the small blue butterflies and so on. So this project we're involved with is about establishing the non-tree species in new native woodland plantings. So there's been lots of planting of trees encouraged by grants, for example, over the last 40 years or so. But they very much focused on the tree species and then getting trees established. And often what's happened is that you get a nice stand of trees, and they're all growing beautifully and it looks good. But when you look at the rest of the flora that belongs in those plant communities, you find that it's often completely lacking. There's no woodland flora there. So this project, which was led by Rick Laurel, who's a forestry consultant, and it involved Nature Scot, Plant Life, Stirling University, and the Forestry Commission Scotland, as it was, and Scotia Seeds, was looking at trying to establish what the best practice would be that we could recommend for getting those other plants into woodlands. And actually, the basic approach is quite simple. So if you assess what you've already got, and ask about whether or not the woodland species are present, or they're present in adjacent woodlands and might move, then if they are, there's no need to do anything much. You can just leave it to get on with it, as long as you're prepared to take time. If most of the species are present, but there are a few important ones that are missing, then you might take a second approach and rely mainly on natural colonization, but add a few species in. But if you've not got any of the species in a woodland that's been newly planted, then it's possible they might not get there at all. A lot of the plantings that have been done on lowland sites are in arable situations, and the arable fields don't have any soil seed bank of woodland species at all. And these species are often extremely slow to migrate. So in the sort of timescales that we want to see things happening, they may never appear in woodland. So in this sort of scenario, that's the time to intervene with adding some plants or seeds if you want to create the complete community. And the overriding thing is that time is short. So because the times for migration are so long, these plants may never reach these sites within the sort of timescales that we want to see them. So we may be talking about at least decades or hundreds of years, and we're all too impatient, and it's all too urgent, really, to wait for that long. So in the sort of first case, this is an example of some plants up Glenfeshie, and Glenfeshie has been a fairly long-term restoration project, which has not introduced any plants at all into the restoration of the woodland. All they've done is reduce the number of grazing deer, and it's been very interesting to see the sort of spectacular and quite quick results that have appeared up Glenfeshie. So I was cycling down the glen in May and found at the top of the glen there's this kind of band of really quite lush and vigorous plants like Lathyrus linifolius and broom, and they're growing quite luxuriantly in a way that I don't really associate with Highland glens, because usually they get eaten so much by grazing animals. So once you reduce that pressure, they really can get away and grow in quite a spectacular way. Really big, lush plants, and they must be fixing a significant amount of nitrogen, which then allows these trees to have a better soil for growing up. Coming along behind them, there seemed to be this kind of band that was as if it was moving up the glen, So there's really no addition of any seeds in that sort of side. Sorry, I'll just go past that. I'm very keen on the reading the popular literature on conservation and rewilding, and keeping up with all the work that's available on that. And this is one of the most popular books, which you might well have read. But I was quite disappointing from a plant point of view about this book, because it doesn't really say an awful lot about plants at all. What it does say, which is particularly disappointing to me, is that wildflower seeds are too expensive, so they didn't use any in this project at NEP. But what they've done is effectively chosen the first option, not to introduce anything, and it means that what's happening there is happening more slowly than it might have happened. So the Isabella tree goes on about how they've got so much creeping thistle and not some of the other sort of grassland plants that they might have expected, but they probably just are not there at all and haven't migrated in yet, and will take quite a long time to do so. I think a much better book about ecological restoration is the Carafran. But unfortunately, it's not likely to be anything like as widely read as the Wilding book. But for all sorts of reasons, this is a much more interesting project. And they've essentially used the middle option, which is to add, apart from the trees themselves, to add a few of the species that were missing from that community, and so they've added them in quite a judicious sort of way. And then in places where there are no seeds present in the soil, but the intention is to create a diverse grassland, then there are lots of examples where sowings have been quite successful in that. So this is the A1 at Haddington, which was upgraded about 20 years ago now, I think. And because in that sort of engineering situation, you're moving lots of soil around that doesn't have any seeds of the relevant species in it, it's been sown with a wildflower mixture. Similarly, in a site in Dundee, it's a very small site right in the centre of Dundee, and it was looking very untidy. People didn't like the way it appeared, with brambles and a lot of Yorkshire fog, and it was looking a bit rough. And the council introduced some rhinanthus into it, and it reduced the grass growth dramatically and made it look much more acceptable. But it's also providing quite a nice basis then for a more diverse sort of sward. And there's another project in Montefieth. This is a community project just to establish a coastal grassland, which was very nice and successful. So when you create a demand for seeds like that, then it can be filled in various ways. And what's tended to happen in Scotland is that lots of seed has moved in from other places. So there has been more seed production and more availability, and sometimes cheaper seed available from other places than Scotland. particularly from continental Europe, but also from the south of England, and in some cases even from North America. Seeds have been brought in and used as wildflower plantings. So in some cases we've had species that are not native, either they're not native to Britain and coming in from Europe, or they're native to Britain but not to Scotland, so they've been moved further north. And the other thing is that they might be the right species, but the populations are not from the area where they're being used. So there's various questions, but that arise as a result of that. Should we be introducing any of these species as climate changes, and we expect the climate to become warmer and species would migrate? Should we be assisting them to do that? And should we be using populations from further south to account for the increased temperatures that we expect? Is that a problem? What we should be doing? There's not a huge amount of work about this. Just a few examples, but and this is not an experimental one. It's actually some seed production. There are two populations on the same site here, growing side by side, and they're photographed on the same day here. So you can see that there's a big difference in the flowering time between an English and the Scottish population. One not sort of obvious consequence of that is the question of whether or not the insect populations that pollinate them are active at the kind of the right time. So there is a bit of experimental work, particularly done by a German group, which looked at different populations collected from around Germany in a common garden situation to test whether or not there was any difference between different seed origins. And what they found was that seeds from different origins, from local origins, grew better. It produced bigger and more productive plants. But the plants produced more flowers, and that they flowered at the right time when the local insects were ready, when they had emerged and were ready for pollination. In addition to that, the seeds from other zones never performed better. And as the distance increased from the site, the performance reduced even further. So there's quite strong evidence for using seeds of local origin, as you might expect. They are simply better adapted. So Germany, for example, has been divided up into seed zones when it comes to using native seeds, and they've divided up the country into 21 different zones, and because that has made it quite complicated for production, they've actually kind of made 21 collection zones, and then they made 8 zones for production. So you can produce collections within one zone. And around Europe, we did a review of seed zones in Europe. So several different countries have adopted that sort of system. France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria. Norway has a slightly more complicated system that's based on altitude as well as geographical distance. And Britain has a set of seed zones for native trees. So that's another question really as to whether or not we can use the tree seed zones for other species. I don't know what you think about that. Are they natural biogeographical areas that can be applied to other plant species as well? Or are they purely limited to trees? And if we wanted a zoning system, do we have to start again with other species? So there's nothing sort of statutory about this except for trees, but these zones are starting to be used for other species than trees, and that's kind of creeping in whether or not we like it. So at the very least, we need traceability of the stuff that we're using and for restoration. But at Scotia Seeds, we've always been interested in other aspects of seed quality, apart from just the straightforward sort of genetic aspects of populations. And we're working with wildflower seeds in a market that's completely unregulated, unlike agricultural seeds where people expect sort of minimum standards, and there's a very well developed system in place to ensure that. Native seeds are really not covered by any regulations, and it does mean that people are selling them without any particular quality standards attaching to them. We always felt that was unacceptable, and that the very least you should do is make sure that the seed was traceable to its original source, and that you've done some kind of testing to make sure that it would actually grow, because seed that is dead is really not much use for anything except for feeding birds. So we've always tested the seeds that we produced, and we became kind of slightly anxious that other people were not doing that. So we surveyed about 15 years ago the seed that we could buy anonymously from other companies. We did this survey with some sponsorship from the Scottish Government, actually. So we looked at the gate companies, and we just kept them anonymous because we weren't intending to embarrass anybody. We were just trying to find out what the situation was. And then this is just a sample of 3 species. There was a much wider range in the whole study. But for Primula viris, for example, we found that there were samples with 0 germination, so not much use if you want cowslips. And there were much higher results, 90%. Similarly, for something like Lycanthemum vulgare, they've got a result which is only 7% germination, where others are much higher, 86, 87. Really, for something like Lycanthemum, there's no reason at all. It's quite unacceptable, I think, that there should be some seed of such low quality being sold. Ocantholum is a very easy seed to deal with, so there's no good reason why the germination should be so poor. We repeated this survey about 10 years later, with a wide range of European samples, and unfortunately the result was pretty similar. There's lots of duff seed available. We were quite interested early on as well to see if there were other aspects of quality or other things affecting seed quality in the seeds that we were producing. I think we were concerned early on that Scotland might be a bit wet and a bit cool for seed production, and certainly the other producers in Britain are located much further south, warmer and drier parts of the country. But having said that, this last summer, when temperatures got up over 40 degrees in the south, I kind of changed my mind about that, and I think we should maybe be asking the question the other way around. Is it getting too hot now in the south of England for production of native seeds? And that's Natasha Ryan, who did this survey work and has been at Scotia Seeds for 15 years or so, and she's still doing that work, along with her slightly less glamorous assistant. So we became part of an EU project, which was funded by it was a Marie Curie project called NASTEC. It was the Native Seed Science and Technology Training Network. And that allowed us to do a whole lot more work on testing methodology and on growing methodology as well. So Mr. Maria Moran, who did a PhD with us, we finished about 4 or 5 years ago. So one of our projects was looking at Bromia vulgaris quality, but also the production conditions that were required. So she was particularly looking at shading the plants and the effect of shading on seed production and quality. The project also included National Trust for Scotland and a lot of outreach work as well. So we were able to involve a lot more people in this whole question of native seeds and their use. So there was a small project looking at translocation of some rare plants up in Lomond, which is what these guys are doing. We produced a series of papers about seed quality. So one of the things we were particularly interested in doing was to establish tests that would indicate the growing potential of seeds without waiting for a full germination test. There are lots of different types of seed dormancy in native seeds, which have obviously not been selected out in the way that agricultural seeds have had their dormancy removed by selection. So to run a germination test often takes a very long time. And in Rhinanthus, for example, which is such an important species in meadows and grasslands, and which people want to use very widely, a germination test takes about 6 weeks, which is too long because the seed is harvested in the autumn or late summer, and then we want to be able to sow the seed before the end of the year. So 6 weeks for a germination test is too long, and the results are often only available after the period when you want to sow the seed. So we looked at tetrazoleum testing as an alternative to germination testing, and the advantage of a tetrazoleum test, which is a stain of living cells within the seed, which can then assess to determine whether or not seed is likely to be viable. That only takes a couple of days, so that was a much more useful test than the germination test. So first of all, we had to establish whether the tetrazoleum test viability was related well to germination tests, and there's a good relationship there. So we felt we could use that, and then we went on to look at whether germination was a good indication of emergence in the field, and we found that it was. So we were quite confident in tetrazoleum testing as a method, as a proxy for germination, and a method of establishing whether crops should actually grow in the field. One of the other nice things that came out of that project was that as the sort of the leading industrial partner in the project, we were able to make contact with lots of other seed producers around Europe, and we formed a society of producers, the European Native Seed Producers Association, which now has 21 members from the north of Finland to the south of Spain. So a very wide range of different conditions, but everybody has quite similar issues about their seed production. It's quite interesting. And the first thing that we did for this association was to create a code of conduct around traceability and origins and seed quality, so that we can try to encourage best practice across the whole of Europe. And that code of conduct is being slowly picked up by other producers. So it should start to distinguish the producers who are not really very interested in seed quality and these questions of origin from other producers. That's a photograph of our seed production in Scotia Seeds, just south of Brechin. But really, it could be a picture of any of the native seed producers around Europe. We have 20 hectares of production that's quite typically set out in lots of small plots. Well, we've now expanded to another site because that's we've run out of space in this site. And these are some of our crops, but they could equally have been taken in lots of other places in Europe. There are probably two basic approaches to seed production. One on the left is just harvesting directly from communities that are semi-natural and already established. There are great limitations with that, logistically, and also in terms of the quality of harvesting. So not many opportunities to do that with grassland species in Scotland, just because so little remains of semi-natural diverse communities. There's much more opportunity in places in some parts of England and in the Alps, for example. That's the main approach to native seed production. The alternative on the right is to grow crops, as you saw in the aerial photo, and harvest them. And the harvesting just uses a whole variety of different means to get the seeds off the plants. So the preferred method, if it's possible, is combine harvester. And we've got some tiny combine harvesters. That's one in comparison to a sort of standard agricultural combine. They're just little babies, really. And other methods include vacuum harvesting on different scales. So you can use a leaf blower in reverse sometimes, or we have this more mechanized form now on a larger scale. Brush harvesting, which just uses a big industrial scale brush. But a lot of work is still done by hand harvesting, or sometimes just sort of seed rake. So, and these methods are pretty similar everywhere. So we're producing about 200 different species of native Scottish plants, and I worked out that over the 25 years that we've been producing, we've produced enough seeds to sow around about 2,500 hectares of grassland and other species, other types of plant communities. So it's just a couple of other projects I'd like to mention. One is the A9, which runs between Inverness and Perth, where I think the Scottish Government are adopting really a kind of best practice approach, in that they've had a project to collect seeds around length of the road, and then to use those seeds for growing crops afterwards, to produce enough seed for the project. It's a huge project, and it's going to last years. There are a few obstacles, financial and planning, to actually completing it. But when the 11 sections that's divided up into are completed, it's going to need about 25 or 30 tons of seeds of native plants. And the usual problem that projects like this have is that the ecological assessment that's done right at the start, or before the project goes ahead, is completely disconnected from what happens several years later, when a contractor will ask for all the seeds that they need for restoration, usually a couple of weeks before they're due to be sown. And the bit in between, nothing happens. So the seed is quite often just not available when it's needed. And that's happened with a great many projects over the years. But contractually, it's very difficult for the client, in this case the Scottish Government, to resolve that. But I think this time they've probably found a way to do that. So the A9 does look as if it will be done properly as much as possible with local sources of seeds. Just one other project, which is the you might know of as the Bug Life's Beeline project, which is running throughout the UK and Scotland. It's kind of by Scotland, and it's a brilliant project because it's all about connectivity and connecting up plant communities with the benefit of insects in mind, but also they're paying quite close attention to the plants as well. So I think this is going to be a great project, really. And one of the things that it allows is for people to really get involved with wild plants, and I'll bring a lot of people into contact with using native seeds. So one of the great things is that people just love seeds. They love handling seeds. They love collecting seeds as a nice sort of community activity. So sowing seeds can be kind of a great thing for people to do. This is a local community sowing seeds at Geordie's Wood, which is a Woodland Trust site a few years ago, and they recorded the bit that each of them had sown, so they could go back and visit it later on afterwards. And this is actually in the meadows, so it's quite a local. Just people have got very involved with looking after their patches of wildflowers. So I'm going to just wind up with a question really for you about our garden escapes, and what I'm interested to know what you think about it. These are both genuine cases that I've been asked about in relation to garden escapes. So the first one is this specimen of pampas grass, which is an exotic, obviously, and it's growing in this fantastic wild environment, just in a garden. This is as you go over from the east coast up towards Alpro, so you pass Loch Lascarna, and before you start to descend towards Loch Broom, there's a couple of houses and the garden. There's no suggestion that this point is escaping, but you can imagine it would quite easily do so when you get along the verges there. And the other example is Echium vulgare, so that is the native to Scotland. But I was asked about it in relation to sowing in somebody's garden in Mull. And the question was, what if it gets out of their garden and it goes more widely in Mull? Is it a problem? Is it a problem because it doesn't appear as a native in Mull, and it's elsewhere in Scotland? Should we be concerned about that? Is it just a problem for recording? And if it is just a problem for recording, is that a problem, a big enough problem that someone might get on to do something about it? And what would we do about it if it was causing people problems? So I'm interested to know what people feel about these two different problems, one greater than the other. Are they problems at all, or should we just leave it all to get on with it? So I don't know whether I've answered one question or any questions at all in this talk, but it probably just raises a whole a whole lot more to stop there. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm very happy.
Very much for that. It's very interesting. Is there any questions? Stop.
Mention the zoning for in European countries for seeds specifically, and then you mentioned that here we have zones for trees, and I'm curious what those zones are based on for like wildflower seeds versus trees, and what your arguments would be for and against using the zones for trees or the zones for wildflowers here.
Yeah, okay. I'll just repeat the question. Tell me if I've got it right. So there are zones for native species, a wide range of wildflower species, essentially, in places in Europe. While in Britain we only have a set of zones that relate to trees. So what do we do about the British ones? Can we use is that
I guess those pre-established zones that exist for trees or wildflowers here, since they already exist, and are there differences in requirements for those zones depending on trees versus wildflowers?
okay? I'm not arguing in favour of using them. I'm genuinely not sure whether they're likely to be relevant to other species. But I think that that no one has really done any work to try and establish whether they fit with other species as kind of general biogeographical zones that might have some effect on the populations. So my feeling is that there's no evidence to support that, and we shouldn't use those zones for other species until there's some work to establish whether or not they really are useful.
Giles, that was a very beautiful aerial photograph of the farm with different paddocks or fields of what you're growing in flowers. How do you choose what species you're going to? Is there any systematic way of choosing what you're going to focus on and what? I presume there's a commercial interest in this, but then there's an awful lot of interesting and often threatened or very scarce wildflower seeds, which will be of extreme interest to conservation, but maybe very little known by seed buying public who presumably finance your project. I mean, are you trying to expand the public's interest and knowledge about some of the scarcer, rarer, less well-known things? Because everybody knows poppies and corn marigolds and cornflowers, but very few people know about blue south thistle or Iceland purslane or something. Some really rare things, or there must be, everything in between. Are you trying to work with conservation as well and expand into growing things which are maybe less commercial, less famous, or are you restricted to commercial, well-known things?
Yeah, so the question is about how we choose what we grow. Is that right?
Yeah.
Basically, so because we're commercial, it helps an awful lot if we can sell what we produce. So the things that people want to see are a lot of meadow species and cornfield annuals. So those would be the main sort of groups of species that we're interested in, and the common species that occur very widely across the country are the ones that people will demand. So that pushes us towards producing, hundreds of kilos of meadow buttercup or common knapweed and so on. But then there is some more sort of I might say more technical restoration work, which demands a range of species that are not necessarily very common. So there is some scope for us to produce those things. There's also a kind of a random element as well, in that it's what, to some extent, what interests us, or what we think people should have available to them, and what we're able to collect. So there is a kind of methodical approach to the collections, and that we're looking for things to create particular plant communities, but there's also an element of personal preference as well. But we're not really involved in anything that's particularly rare, because the interest in those species would be so small. But there's nothing particularly to stop us if anyone is interested. But they would probably be for particular projects, rather than for general sale for those things.
I think, well, Jonathan was before John, sorry.
Thank you for the talk. In nature, plants, flowers grow in communities of many species, and you're raising them in, for obvious production reasons, in monocultures. Does that produce problems for you? Disease and things like that?
I think in some cases it probably does produce problems, but we're usually growing them on quite a short sort of rotation cycle. So and the reason for that is because the biggest problem in this kind of arable production is actually weed control, and so a lot of these perennial species tend to just become very weedy, and then they're not viable as crops anymore. So we don't keep very many crops for longer than about 4 years, and then we'll return them to rotation. So I think pests and diseases are maybe a bit limited by that. But having said that, we have seen kind of interesting build-up of pests sometimes. For instance, we've been growing green figwort for a while, and there's a particularly disgusting little insect that grows on that feeds on green figwort, and it just destroys the whole crop. And it doesn't kill the plants; they recover, but they keep coming back year after year. So we've had to move our production around somewhere else so that away from that. But having said that, we have got some crops which are very old. So 1 or 2 crops surviving that are over 20 years old, and they still continue to produce. Agremonia is one, and Campanula latifolia seems to live for a long time as well. So these crops have been in our fields since 1998. Still going.
Thank you. We've just got time for one more question, John.
Well, what I haven't seen very much of is follow-up work. The work when you have established an artificial meadow, well, it looks beautiful at first. Rather like buying fireworks, it goes off wonderfully, and then the year after, it's not so good, and then the year after that, it's hardly there at all. So I'm interested in the views about that. So there's the ecological reason for that? What is the ecological reason for that?
Yeah.
And secondly, what about the ethical side of selling people a box of fireworks? They think it's going to endure, and their children will enjoy it. But after 3 or 4 years, there's not much there.
Are you talking about the visual aspect of it?
Well, the species composition, which presumably is related to the visual aspect. So the ones I've seen, they look absolutely mind-blowingly beautiful at first, but then the next year they're not so good, and then they hardly exist in the sample.
I think it depends a lot on individual sites and their management, because there are also lots of examples of them going the opposite way. So that in the first year or two, they can be dominated very strongly by certain species, such as the company of Bulgaria is very obvious when it looks vast white flowering in the first year, and that tends to be quite short-lived if the meadow is managed by cutting and real cuttings. And then other species will develop after that. So I think it can go either way in terms of its diversity and interest and usefulness to other species. And I do think that all we're doing in selling, a bag of seeds of 30 species, for example, is that we're really only starting the process of, and we accept that whatever you sow is going to change quite rapidly, in ecological terms anyway, but from year to year. So you'll lose some species, but also gain species as well. So it's just starting a process which is then dependent on management and the site itself. But it's impossible to know everything about a site. So all you can do when you're selling things is give people as kind of the best advice about their site that you can, and suggest how they should manage it. But what actually happens is often quite different. But it's worthwhile for people who are involved to see this process. I think it's quite important, and so many people have become involved in managing plant communities as a result. I think that's a very worthwhile aspect.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. We'll have to bring that to an end now because time is passing. So thank you very much for very interesting. Website and check the details and get the reminders email sent to. Very much. That was great. Didn't actually try and I don't know.
I'd like to, yeah.
I just know okay, no, I didn't know. Yes, absolutely. No, because when we were counting the numbers, I didn't think to turn around. Sorry about that, Greg. You can ask your question now. I just realised.
No,